this example, we will show you how to call a superclass constructor from a subclass constructor. First, we will design a superclass. Then we will design a subclass from this superclass. Then we will write a small demo program showing you how to create objects from these classes. In the superclass, we want to design a class named employee that has the following information in fields. When we say fields, it means data and methods. The class has a private data members for the employee's name, number, and hire year, all of a string type. The employee number should follow a certain format. Should have 3 digits, followed by dash, followed by an uppercase letter. Also, this class will include a constructor that initializes all data members from the input parameters. So there is no default constructor, we have a constructor with arguments. Also, the class will have getter and setter methods for all data. And there is one note here, is that in the setter method for number, because it should follow a certain format, we would like first to validate the format of the number. If it is not valid, we will assign an empty string. And also, we will call this method in the constructor to initialize number. In other words, when we create an object from this class, or when this constructor is called from subclass, first we have to make sure that the employee number follows this format. If it is not following this format, then the number will be assigned an empty string. Now let us go to JGrasp to implement this class. To implement the employee class, we need to create a new file in JGrasp, public class, the name employee. First, we will start defining the data members for the employee class. Private string, first is the name, next is the employee number, and we will write it empnum for short, and then we will have the hire date. After that, we need to define the constructor. For the constructor, it should initialize all the data members. So this is how we are going to define it. First, we will pass the name as input parameter to the constructor. Next is the employee number, num. Next is the hire date, h. In the beginning here, we will just copy the input parameters to the data, and then later we will change the code for setting the employee number, because we have to use the set method for employee number in the constructor so that the set method validates the input num. So first we will copy name. Next is the employee number. Next is the hire date. So before we proceed, we would like to make sure that we don't have any syntax errors. First, we will save the class. Then we will compile. So now we don't have any errors, so that we can proceed and continue writing the code for the employee. Next is defining the setters and getters. So here we write comment, getters and setters. First we will write the getters, public string get name, return name. Next is public string get empnum, return empnum. Next is public string get hire date, return hire date. And now for the setters, public void set name, and we need an input parameter for the new name. So we will copy n into name. Next is public void set empnum, and also we need a new employee number as input parameter. We will call it num. So we will have empnum is equal to num. The last set method for hire date. set higher date h, and here we will have higher date is equal to h. Let us compile the program, the class, and as you can see that it does not have any errors, so now we can continue writing the code for the rest of the class. So now we need to implement the validation for the employee number, but before that, remember that in the problem statement it says that we have to use the set method for assigning the employee number. So let us go to the constructor. Here now we are in the constructor, so we say set emp num, and we supply num as input parameter. Next we will go to the set employee number method, set method for the employee number, which is this one, and we need to change it and make it test for the input parameter num whether it is valid or not valid. So before we assign num into employee num, we are going to test whether num is valid or not. So here I'm going to write a comment and I'm going to say num is valid. If this is the case, then we will assign num, that is the input parameter, to employee num data member. Otherwise, we'll assume that the employee number is empty. So we will say emp num equal to empty. Next is how to check whether the input parameter num is valid or not. We're going to write a Boolean method that returns true if the input parameter num is valid, otherwise it returns false. We are going to call this method isValid emp num. isValid emp num, and we are going to supply num as input parameter. In the definition for this method, it will return Boolean. The name will be isValid emp num, and the input will be a string that represents the employee number. Inside here, just for testing, we will assume that this will return a true, so this will always assume that num is valid. Just for testing, before writing any extra code and we have more syntax errors, let us now check at this point whether we have errors or not. As you can see, we don't have any errors, so everything is as planned. Now inside isValid emp num, first we will test for the length of the input parameter num. It should be exactly 5, 3 digits, dash, and uppercase letter. So if the length is not equal to 5, so we say num dot length not equal 5, then we have to return false, that is invalid. To do that, I'm going to define a local variable that is Boolean called status, and this status will be first assume that it is true. That means that the input parameter num is valid. Now if the length is not equal to 5, then we will change this status to false, and after that the method will return a status as a return value for validation. So what if the length is equal to 5? So we will go to else, and here we will test for the validation of the input parameter num. To check for individual characters of the input parameter num, whether they are digits, uppercase, and so on, we are going to use the wrapper class for the char primitive data type that is called character. Remember that for every primitive data type, there is a corresponding wrapper class. For example, for int, there is integer, I capital letter. For double, there is double wrapper class, D capital letter, and so on. So to test for individual characters of a string, then we are going to use methods inside this wrapper class. So let us start. So first we need to test the first character in the input parameter num, whether it is a digit or not. So the wrapper class character, C capital letter, dot, we will use the method inside this wrapper class is digit, and this method is a Boolean method. It returns true if the input parameter is really a digit. So we will supply the first character of num as input parameter to this method. So we write num.char at 0. Next, we will test for the next character in num. And this also must be a digit. So we will copy the code, but we will supply char at index 1. Finally, the third character, which is at index 2, we are also going to test whether it is a digit or not. These three conditions all should be true. So therefore, we have to use AND between them. Next, we want to test that the character at index 3 is a dash. So we write num char at 3 equal, and this is the character for dash between single quote. Finally, we need to test that the last character in num is an uppercase letter. So this will be at index 4, but instead of using sdigit method, we are going to use another method in this wrapper class that is called uppercase. And now, if all of these conditions are true, then the input parameter num is valid. So what we will do, we will save the result of this condition into status. So if any of these conditions is false, status will be false, and this method is valid is going to return false. This completes the implementation for the method is valid employee num, and now we need to test it, to test the class that does not have any syntax error. So there is no syntax error. Later, when we write a demo program to demonstrate creating objects from this class, we will see whether this method is working fine or not. After implementing the employee class, now we want to write a class named production worker that extends the employee. So the employee class will be the superclass and the production worker will be the subclass. This class, which is the production worker, should have fields to hold the following information. First is an integer that represents a shift. If it equals to 1, then it means day shift. And if it is equal to 2, then it means night shift. Also, we need to have hourly pay rate as a double for the production worker. This class also needs a constructor that initializes all data, including the superclass data for the employee, and set and get methods for the data members in this class. So let's go to JGrasp to implement this subclass. To implement the production worker class, we need to create a new file, a new Java, public, class, production worker, and this class extends the employee class. First, we will define the data for the production worker, private integer shift, private double pay rate. Now for the variable shift, the value 1 represents day shift and the value 2 represents night shift. So it's better we define these constants as constants inside this class. So we will go to the beginning of the class. We will define the constants here. Public, static, final, integer, day, shift is equal to 1. We will define night shift in the next line. And we will set its value to 2. We are defining these constants as static because we want them always available in the class, so that whenever we want to refer to them, we can refer to them by the class name. Next is defining the constructor. So here we will define the constructor. And as you remember that the constructor should initialize all the data, including the superclass data. So public production worker. First, we will initialize the superclass data. So first is a string name, string num. Next is a string hire date. Then we will supply the data for shift and pay rate to the constructor. Now for shift and pay rate, since they are defined in the same class, so we can access them directly. So we say shift is equal to S, and we say pay rate is equal to R. Now for the superclass data members, how we initialize them? Since we are inheriting their set methods, let us use their set methods. So we say set name n, set emp num, and finally set hire date h. But this way we are going to have a syntax error. Why? Because we don't have a default constructor in the superclass employee. So let us go to employee. So here we have a constructor with parameters. So this is not a default constructor. So when the system tries to call a default constructor and doesn't find one, it will complain and issue a syntax error. Let me show you this. First, we will save the file, then compile it. So as you can see, we have a syntax error. It says constructor employee in a class employee cannot be applied to given types. So now how to call the constructor in the superclass employee? We call it by using the keyword super. So we say super, and we supply the parameters name, employee number, and hire date. And remember that you have to call the superclass constructor in the beginning of the constructor for the subclass. So now let us compile the class. As you can see, we don't have any problems. But if you try to remove calling the superclass constructor statement super, different place than the first statement. Let's say in the second statement. Now if we try to compile, and now as you can see, it says that call to super must be first statement in constructor. So we will return it back. And now the system is calling the superclass constructor to initialize the superclass data. Then it will come back and execute the rest of the statements in the subclass constructor. Next is writing the getters and setters for the two private data member shift and pay rate. So here we will define the setters and getters. Public integer get shift, and here we return shift. Public double get pay rate, return pay rate. And now for the setters, public void set shift. The input parameter is S, so we say shift is equal to S. And finally, the set method for pay rate, set pay rate double R. So pay rate is equal to R. And this completes the implementation of the class production worker. Let us compile it to make sure that it does not have any errors. So now, as you can see, it is free of errors. After implementing the subclass employee and implementing the superclass production worker, we want to write a demo program demonstrating creating objects from these classes. So we will demonstrate the classes by writing a program that uses a production worker object. So now we are back in JGrasp. To write a demo program, we need to create a new file, a new Java file, public class worker demo, and we are going to write the main method inside it, public static void main string args. We are going to create an object from the production worker. So we write production worker, which is the class name. PW, the reference. New, the constructor is production worker. First, we will supply a name for the employee, Ali Hassan. Employee number, we will follow the format, the valid format, that is a 3 digits, 342-A. Next is the hire date. It will be September 15, 2005. And the shift will be day shift. So we are going to reference the constant day shift from the class production worker because we defined it as a static. Production worker dot day shift, comma, pay rate 16.5. Let us save the file and let us compile the program or the class to test that it does not have any error. As you can see, it does not have any error. If we try to run it, there is nothing appears on the output screen. Before we try to call the methods inside production worker, we want to test the validity of the method that we have designed in the superclass employee. The method that tests whether the employee number is valid or not. How to do this? We can do this through the object PW. Because remember that PW is a subclass from the employee class. And inside the employee class, the validity method is defined as public. So it will be inherited. So therefore, we can call it from the subclass production worker. So we say PW dot is valid emp num, and now we will supply some testing strings for the employee number. For example, if we give it 123-D, you know that this is a valid employee number. So we will print the result. We will say system.out.println, and we will say validity equal, and we will print the return value. The return value is either true or false. If it is valid, it is true. If it is invalid, then it is false. Now let us run it. So as you can see the output here, it says that validity is true. Now let us change the first digit and put, let's say, Q. Now run it. Now run it again. So validity is false. Let us change the second digit and put the Q. So we will go over all the characters in the string. Again, validity is false. And we will change now the third one to Q. Again is invalid. We will change minus to plus and return Q to, let's say, a number 6. Again invalid, so we will come back to dash, and here we will put any symbol. Let's say Y, small letter. It is not accepting. It says validity is false, so it should be Y capital letter. Now it is accepted. So now the validity is true. Our next discussion, although it is not required in the problem statement, is how to print the information of an object that is created from production worker. I mean how to print the employee name, employee number, hire date, whether day or night shift, and pay rate. Although we have get methods for all of this data, some of them are inherited, but it's not a good idea that we print this information in the main program. A good idea is that each class is responsible of its data. So we need to have, let's say, a method inside employee that is responsible for displaying the employee name, number, and hire date. And we would like to have a method inside the production worker that is responsible for printing whether day shift or night shift and pay rate. And it is easy to do that. You just simply provide a void method that is called display without any input parameter. The second option is that you write toString method for employee as well as for production worker. So in your main program, whenever you want to display the information of an object that is created from production worker, you simply write system.out.println and you give pw as an input parameter to the print, and automatically the system will call toString. But since we have the same method defined in a superclass and also defined in subclass, this is called overriding, so we need to be careful on how to deal with such methods.